All right, welcome, rack gear enthusiasts and other afflicted individuals. I'm here with the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Michael Soldano in his shop with some historical rack gear. There's some stories and some details about the rack gear that I think we all should know. And I'm going to ask Mike some questions, and we'll see what pearls of wisdom he bestows on us. So, Mike, what was the first rack preamp that you made?
The X88.
Okay.
X88r. So this was the my very first foray into preamps, and the original prototype that I built for this, I built for Steve Lukather.
Oh wow!
Because Steve had just gotten his SLO from me several months earlier, and through that whole process, I then met Bob Bradshaw, and of course, you know, Luke had his racks and everything. And so the big question was like, well, can you make a preamp sound like a loaded amp going through a rack system, you know, going into a dummy load? And I was like, yeah, I think it can be done, because the SLO relied so heavily on the preamp for its sound, and it didn't rely on the power amp for its sound. So you could get that same tone at any volume just by turning the masters up and down. So I felt very confident that that preamp could be a standalone and sound just the same, which it did. So that's how the X88 came to be.
So is the X88 really an SLO in rack form, or are there any differences between the preamp section of both?
No, they're exactly the same.
Okay.
So the third channel is exactly the overdrive channel of an SLO, exact circuitry. The second channel is the SLO with the crunch switch on. It is, however, a little bit gainier. So yes, I should say that there is a little change. There is a little more gain in this, because since we have a dedicated clean channel, I decided to push the gain a little further in the crunch channel. So this is the crunch channel of an SLO 100, but with a bit more gain, which tends to make it a little bit darker, but just a skosh.
Okay.
And then the clean channel is the clean channel of an SLO, or it's the normal channel of the SLO with the switch in the clean mode, and then it has the same bright normal switch that it had, and same with the crunch channel. It has the capability of bright normal, which you would have in the normal channel of an SLO. So it's essentially the three tonal modes of an SLO in preamp form.
Okay. So when did the SP77 come out?
So the SP77 came out a bit later. So the X88 had been in production for quite a while, and there were a lot of guys that were kind of approaching me and going like, hey, you know, we get what you're doing here, we love it, but we don't need that much capability, and we don't have that kind of money, because these were fairly expensive in the day. So that's when I decided to do the Series 2, which was going to be my less expensive version. And about the same time, I was also doing the Hot Rod 50, which is the Series 2 of the amp line. It was the first of the Series 2 amps, which became kind of the Hot Rod series. I kind of dropped the whole Series 2 thing. That kind of went out the window because I just didn't think it was important.
Okay.
So anyway, so the the SP77, it probably came out around 90, 91, somewhere in there. And I'm sorry I'm not more clear on that, but memory gets a little fuzzy after so many years. But this came later, and what this is, still the SLO 100's overdrive channel. Same circuitry right here, same thing. But because now we only have one normal channel, I needed it to kind of bridge what this could do, you know, these two together. So what this is a modified version of the normal channel of the SLO 100.
Okay.
It's got probably a little bit less gain than an SLO in the crunch, with the crunch mode on in the normal channel.
Okay.
But it's not as clean either as the SLO in the clean mode, or the normal channel with the clean switch on. So it's kind of in between there. So you can get a clean sound by turning the gain way down on this puppy.
Okay.
But you can still get it to crunch up when you turn the gain all the way up. So it kind of gives you like the middle ground between these two extremes of these two channels here.
Gotcha. So it's a unique channel for all people that collect rack gear. You got to have both. You can't just buy one. You have to have both.
Yeah, you got it both because this channel is different than both.
This
of
is a
these.
unique channel, and it isn't one of those.
It's not exactly. So collect them up. Get, you know, you thought you were done collecting. It's time to add some more to your collection.
So an offshoot of that, actually, this is a good question. So what is the difference between, say, this SP77 and the one that was made in Japan?
Essentially the same.
Okay.
Circuit-wise, construction is different. So the original, excuse me, the original Japanese one was the first version. That was the original SP77.
Oh wow. Okay. So that came before this.
It came before this one,
Right.
exactly. And the whole idea there was, at the time that I was trying to get into this more affordable price point, I decided to, and again, that's hence the Series 2 nomenclature.
Yeah.
I had a distributor in Japan who had also capability for manufacturing.
Okay.
And he was the one that kind of convinced me to, you know, try Japanese manufacturing, because he said he could really, you know, he could really undercut what I could build it for in my shop at the time in Hollywood.
Okay.
Later Van Nuys. And he felt that he could, you know, get the volumes up that I couldn't do with just a small little hands-on group that I had building the amps at the time. And he was right at the time, because for me I couldn't figure out how to move to that level of doing a lot of things at once.
Yeah.
And so I designed it, he built it, or his company that he contracted through built it, and it worked out for a while. But then the problem I was having on my end, and it was great for him because he didn't even have to import them. I mean, he could just walk over and pick them up at his factory and start distributing them in Japan. The problem for me, though, it was costing me money to bring them over to the U.S.
Oh wow.
So by the time they landed here, the savings weren't quite as great as what we had anticipated.
Got it.
And so I was kind of looking at it, and I was like, well, you know, it's time for me then to reassess how I manufacture things and design things myself.
Okay.
And so the first thing I did was, so the first amp in this series, the Series 2, was the SL60.
Yes.
So the SL60 basically was the precursor to the Hot Rod 50.
Okay.
Again, same circuit for the most part, a few little minor tweaks here and there. And the Hot Rod 50 and the SL60 were the lead channel of an SLO 100, just like this.
Okay.
You know, 50-watt head.
Oh, makes a lot of sense.
So when I decided that I didn't want to do the import thing anymore, my guy Cozy in Japan quit making the SL60 and the preamp, and I started ramping up to build those things in my shop I had just moved into in Van Nuys. So now I had the space to actually do that. When I was still in Hollywood, I couldn't do it. And when we originally started the Series 2 line, I was still in Hollywood in literally, I think my front room where I did the amp building was 12 by 12, so it was 144 square feet. I just couldn't have done any kind of volume. I didn't have a place to store parts. The whole shop, including where I lived, was only 700 square feet.
Oh, wow.
So it was small.
Yeah, there's no way.
But when I moved to the new space out in Van Nuys, I had room all of a sudden, so I could take it on. And so the first thing I did was put the Hot Rod 50 together, redesigned it so that I could build it in the States. We put the Hot Rod 50 out. This came a little bit later.
Okay.
So there was actually kind of a lull between the Japanese SP77s and the American ones. There was kind of a little gap in time.
Yeah.
But then, when we started cranking these up, I found a contract manufacturer in Simi Valley to build these for me.
Okay, so not far away. Really?
Not far away. So then we were able to, you know, build quantities, get the price down, and we built a lot of SP77s. They were preamps.
Do you know how many X88s and SP77s you made?
I don't really know how many X88s I made. There aren't that many.
And they're very sought after.
Yeah, I'd say I'd be surprised if there were more than 200 of them.
Oh, really?
Maybe maybe 300. We made about 1,000 of these, or 1,500 of these.
Oh, wow. So roughly 3 times as many SP77s
Yes.
were made than X88s.
Yes. We made a lot of these guys.
Wow.
So, yeah, so I think we hit about 1,000 on these, and
Okay.
there's probably, like, say, maybe 300 of these, but I'm leaning more towards about the 200 number, because I really don't think we made that many.
Got it.
Again, my record keeping back in those days was sketchy at best, and now my memory's even worse, so between the two, a lot of this is lost to history.
That's why I'm happy to record this.
Yeah,
You can
right,
tell
because
me-
if you ask me next year, I'm not gonna remember anything, so you better get it now.
So then the one that's missing is the X99.
Yes.
So that came out after both of these were out in the market.
Exactly, the X99 was actually on the drawing board, and I was working on it right after the X88. So actually even before this guy.
Okay.
But it was still just a long ways from being anything.
Being a product.
So it actually didn't become a product until about 1991. And by that time, these were well in production, and these actually had started production.
Okay.
So yeah, so the 99 was the final, the final level that I was taking my whole preamp family to. It was the ultimate version of all this technology.
Oh, and it is. It's
The
a beautiful thing.
The summation of everything was the 99.
So where did you get the idea for the motorized pots?
Well, that's a great story, because I came down to LA in 1987 to start my business. And prior to that time, I was just, a guy hanging out in Seattle, playing in a few bands, and I built an amp for myself, which became the SLO. And so I hadn't had any real experience going into large recording studios. I'd been in demo studios before and seen some small stuff. So the inspiration for the 99 came from my first visit to Ocean Way Studios in Hollywood.
Oh, wow.
I had gone up there to meet with an artist who I can't remember who it was at this point in time, but I was sitting in the control room, hanging out with the engineer, and stuff was going on, and they were doing some playback, and I glanced over at the mixing board and saw the faders doing all this, they're and I'm like, whoa, what is this? And I'm like, what is that? I'm asking the engineer, and he's looking at me like I fell off a turnip truck or something. And he's like, you've never seen an automated mixing board before? And I go, well, no, actually I haven't, And he says, well, it's driven, he's a really cool guy. And he's like, well, it's run by MIDI. MIDI is a time code. And I was like, well, what's MIDI, And he's like, God, you don't even know what MIDI is. I was pretty, like I said,
This was the 90s. This was a long time ago.
Yeah, this was the late 80s, early 90s. And I was kind of a plug it in and play kind of guy. I had my hot tube amp and a guitar, and that's all I did. I had very few effects, and so MIDI was still new to me too. So he explained to me MIDI, time code, blah blah blah, but he said that it's all automated, and that there were motors moving the faders that were being driven by the MIDI program, where you could store all those presets.
Yeah.
And I thought, bam! Oh, wouldn't that be cool if you could do an amp that way? And so that's what inspired the motorized pots in the X99, because up to that point, I had heard about things like voltage-controlled actuators, which are little solid-state chip devices, which you can use to change resistor values on the fly, and you could build probably a programmable preamp using those, but the problem is you compromise the tone, because the audio path now has to go through all this solid-state circuitry, these VCAs, And so learning about the motorized pots, all of a sudden the light went on. I was like, well, gosh, I can keep the audio path completely isolated from any of the other stuff, because I can still run it through real potentiometers that are being turned by electric motors. So I teamed up with Tim Caswell of Studio Electronics, because I knew nothing about designing MIDI circuits or digital anything, but he did. He was really brilliant at that stuff. And so I basically said, Tim, what we need is a robot that can turn 5 motors and turn on and off 3 switches for the 3 modes, well, 4 switches including the bright switch. So clean, crunch, overdrive, and then bright and normal. And he's like, can do. So he designed the computer to drive the motors. And then we used a ganged pot that had one half of the pot set a signal to the MIDI computer to tell it where the knob was so it would know when to stop the motor.
Yeah.
And then the other half of the pot would be whatever audio value I needed to run the bass, middle, treble, preamp, master volume controls through. And so by marrying those two things together, I could build the audio amp on a completely separate board, separate circuit, completely isolated from all of the robotics that was controlling it.
Yeah.
So it would literally be the same as you just walking up to this amp and turning the knobs manually by hand and having 5 hands and being able to do that on the fly.
Yeah.
And that was the whole inspiration and culmination of the X99.
Yeah. So it basically, it wasn't just 3 channels. It was as many channels as you could program MIDI and be able to command to then change everything to where
Yeah,
it
so
was.
basically, yeah, it had 128 presets in its memory, and I think you could expand that with external devices.
Oh man.
So you had room for 128 presets, and you could choose which mode it was. And so mode 1 was the clean channel of the X88. Mode 2 was the crunch channel. Mode 3 was the overdrive channel. So internally, every time you pushed one of those mode buttons, it would turn on and off switches internally in the audio board that would reroute the circuitry or the signal path to duplicate the circuitry of these 3 channels.
Okay.
And so you could have 128 overdrive channels if that's what you chose to do. You always use that overdrive mode, you know.
Yeah.
Or you could have, 50 cleans and 3 crunches and 85, whatever combination you wanted to do was all available. And what made that amp also unique from almost any other MIDI controllable preamp, whether solid state or tube, that preceded or followed it, was all of it was controllable in real time, which meant if you wanted to, you could take a MIDI controller with pedals and you could assign a pedal to any one of the knobs or to all of them if you wanted to. And you could then rotate the pots with your foot on a MIDI control pedal in real time. So you could set the thing up so that not only could you change channels with your MIDI controller, but say you wanted to put the mid-range pot on a pedal, you could use it like for a wah-wah maybe. And because it was all motorized and because the motors were very fast, there was no latency whatsoever. It was just like, as you rock the pedal on the floor, the knob would just follow the rocking,
I've got to
and
try
so
that.
a lot of guys would put their output level on a MIDI pedal because in that way they could use it as a swell pedal
Yeah.
and completely control their volume as a volume pedal, but rather than having the signal go through the volume pedal, they were just turning the volume control on the amp up and down using MIDI control.
Wow.
And there was no other amp that could do that, and I don't think there's ever been an amp since that, the X99, that can do it. So
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of devices out there, or like Hook makes an amp called the Wizard that is encoders in the front that move on their own based on what channel you do. But we're talking something that came out in the late 2018, 17, 15-ish versus something that was late 80s, early 90s. So we're talking 20 years passed before anybody even came close to that. Yeah, I had no idea about the volume pedal.
Oh yeah, and so you could put all 5 pedals, all 5 knobs on pedals, and you could actually then just make up presets as you go.
It could be gain, it could be volume.
It could be anything,
That's incredible. I gotta
So
try
that was kind of a unique feature. That was pretty cool.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
But back to just, it's every channel that's on an X88, but completely controllable.
Completely controllable, yes.
Wow. So all those guys out there that can't find X99s, feel good that you got all those tones with an X88 if you can find one of those.
Yeah. Exchange one rare thing for another.
Wow. And so how many X99s did you say? As many as X88s or less? Or
I, again, can't remember, but I'm thinking it was less than 200.
less than 200, okay.
Probably more like about 150.
Wow.
Yeah, we were never a high volume.
High volume, but low volume, but great components, great builds, quality products. Yeah, that's wow. And then the other rack stuff you have an SLO.
Yes, there's an SLO rack now.
And then I think you said this was a custom.
This is a unique custom thing. So back in I can't remember what year it was exactly, but it was when Steve Stevens went off on his own, and Billy Idol then got Mark Youngersmith as his guitar player.
Okay.
And so Mark used to be involved with Charlie Sexton, great player, nice guy too. So Mark, when he got the gig, was kind of like auditioning amps, I guess you'd say.
Okay.
And I had a chance to show him an SLO 100, which I did, and he fell in love with it. And he says, well, I love this amp, but I'd like it in a rack form. Well, I said, I make it in a rack form, I can give you that. He says, well, I'm also, I do a wet, dry, wet kind of thing, and I want to spread out stereo. And he says, I currently use 100 watt high watts for the for the two outer, you know, the amps that get all the affected stuff.
Yeah.
And so he says, well, what do you think of that? I said, well, and his whole thing is he was having Bob Bradshaw, I think, build him a rack system. So he wanted everything to be in racks.
Okay.
I said, well, you know what we could do is I could build you a pair of 100 watt high, you know, DR103 clones using my power section, and we could make them rack mountable, and then that way you've got everything in a rack. You've got your SLO, your 2 high watt clones, and then you plug it into your rack, and you're good to go.
All right, so that's where the SLOWatt came from. There's some there's a video out there. No, actually, it's a camera profile pack.
Oh,
that's SLOWatt, and it was one of his.
I didn't know somebody
did that. Yeah, I'll show you where that is. But somebody
learns something new every day.
There's 2 of those. I've seen those for sale on Reverb, and they were ridiculously priced when they were.
So there's 3 that were ever built.
Oh wow!
There's 2 black ones, which were the first ones that he got.
Okay.
And then there's this one.
Wow.
And so I don't know where those other 2 are.
Yeah, they're somewhere out there in the world.
They're somewhere out there in the world. But what they are is they're an SLO chassis, as you can see.
Yeah.
And then I basically took the 2 channels of the high watt, duplicated all their circuitry, but combined them on a single input jack, as if you were to take, you know, your jumper cord and combine the input jacks. And then it's the whole preamp and the tone stack is all high watt. The present circuit's high watt, and then it just has an SLO power section.
Okay.
And so his touring rig was the 2 black amps, and then later I built this backup for him, and then much later he got out of that whole rig and he wanted to do something different, so I traded him this amp and this amp for some combos and some other things, I think is what we did. And so I got one of the high watt clones back, and then I got a rack mount SLO, because by that time I didn't even have one of these of my own. So I was lucky that one came my way. So that's the story behind these guys. Yeah. So this basically, you plug it in, it sounds like a high watt. You know, it's like a big old, you know, loud, clean amp.
All right. So the really rare stuff. That's one of the really rare things.
Super rare, because like I say, I have one of them. So there's 2 others out there, and that's all there is.
So speaking of rare things, Dave Friedman's been teasing me with the 1U SLO preamp that was made. Now I confirmed with Mike, 3 made.
Maybe 3. More like 2.
More like 2.
I somehow think there was 3, but the only one I remember for absolute sure was one I built for my friend Joey Brasler. That's the only one I remember. I can visualize in my mind and know exactly what it looked like.
Yeah.
But I do think I built another one for somebody else who heard his.
Yeah.
And I might have done yet another one beyond that, but these were all hand built. I never had my own, you know, manufactured chassis for them.
Yeah.
These were built using off the shelf, 1 rack space chassis that I would buy from like Keystone or Bud or one of those companies. I can't remember who I got from now. So maybe Hammond. It's probably Hammond. I'm thinking about it, it's probably Hammond. So, anyway, I bought an enclosure, all vector board layout with eyelets, hand wired, hand built, hand drilled, you know, punched all the holes in the chassis. So there's no graphics on, there's no silk screening that says SLO, you know, preamp 1 or whatever, nothing like that. Maybe Dymo label, I might have put Dymo label on some, just to label like the input and the output on the back. But they were all unique, no 2 were alike. Wow. And the only thing they had in common was they all had the SLO circuit.
Circuit inside.
So super rare.
Yeah, like unobtainium rare. But if anybody out there has one, the collector wants to talk to you. We'll make a deal, I think. We'll try. And then you said on the bottom is your prototype?
This is the prototype for the SP77,
Okay.
basically. So what I did was, just to try the whole thing out, I took an X88 chassis and I got a blank front panel from, again, probably
Yeah.
Keystone or something.
Okay.
Drilled it out, laid it out, and so this is all put in with number stamps that I filled in with a little bit of red
Oh, wow.
ink. So,
Yeah.
and so it's basically, if you look at the back of it, you think I've got another X88 in the rack, but from the front, it's a 2-channel amp.
2-channel, yeah.
And then inside, it's just a vector board, all, hand laid up kind of thing. And so that's the prototype that I did to do all the tweaking, especially when I was trying to suss out this normal channel. I had to do a little, I do a lot of ear listening just to see where the limits of the gain should be, so that it would at least transition nicely into the overdrive channel. And so this was the mule that became this,
Okay.
and the Japanese one as well. So.
Wow. And then there's the 2 rack pieces that I always forget about, which are equally hard to find.
Yeah. Well, we only made less than 100 of these.
Oh my God.
I was supposed to make 100 of them, but unfortunately, a couple of the chassis had blems in them, so they never got built. So I think there's 98 surf boxes out there,
Wow.
including this one.
Well, which is reverb and trem.
It's reverb and trim, yeah. So this has a really awesome reverb unit with a full-length tank, fills the entire
Oh wow,
chassis.
long spring.
Long
Yes.
spring. And then it's got a rather unique trem circuit in that it's 2 different types of trem on the same oscillator. So they're in time with each other, but they're 2
Okay.
different kind of sounds. So the vibrato one is kind of more what you would expect out of a early Fender Vibrolux or something. It's
Okay.
that kind of one that sort of goes, it's kind of like a high-low pass filter thing. So it has kind of that weird, I used to call it pulso trem. That's why I labeled it that.
Oh yeah.
So what this one does is it actually, if you look at, or if you listen to an early Fender Vibrolux, it's really not as much tremolo as it is a thing where it's running the signal through a high pass filter and then a lower pass filter. And so it's kind of almost not really pitch shifting, because it's not changing the pitch, but you're hearing different parts of the note frequency-wise. And at the same time, it is putting a very low oscillation pulse on the loudspeakers. So the speakers are actually moving at the same speed that you set the tremolo at. And so the reason you're getting a tremolo effect is not only this frequency shift, but you're also getting a Doppler shift. So like if you're like standing by a train track and a train goes by and it's blowing its whistle, the pitch changes as it goes by you, because when it's coming towards you, you're getting the frequency compressed a little bit because of the fact that it's covering time as it comes. And as it pulls away from you, it stretches the waveform a little bit and it lowers the pitch. And they call that Doppler shift.
Yeah.
So, look it up in any high school physics book. But anyway, so the way those early circuits worked, they actually did create somewhat of a pitch change because of the Doppler shift. So you could truly call it vibrato, because it was like bending a string, it was an up and down pitch change. And it was because of the Doppler that was being applied to the speaker. And so that's what this part of the circuit does. It actually it puts a pulse on your speaker that's sub-audio. It will give you that Doppler shift, and it does the high and low pass filter thing.
Wow.
And then this is true tremolo, where it's just amplitude modulation, just volume, on, off. And so this uses an optical resistor.
So the surf box and then the space box
Came later.
Okay.
And so a lot of people fell in love with this. And I say, once I finished designing this and started getting into production on it, I realized it was way too expensive to produce and way too labor intense. So I decided right then and there that I was going to limit it to 100 pieces.
Okay.
Because I was going to lose money on every single one of
Oh
them.
no.
So, because back then they were only, I think, $1,100. They weren't like $3,500 and up that you see them for on eBay nowadays.
More.
Or more.
Yeah, or more, yeah.
So we only made 100 of these, but people loved it, and a lot of guys were like, well, I really love the Surfox, but I really like about it is the reverb, not as necessary about the tremolo.
Yeah.
So I decided to do a lower cost version that was just the reverb,
Gotcha.
and that's what the Space Box was.
Okay.
So
Okay.
this is basically this reverb circuit, and it was a pretty good product, but unfortunately, at the time I was being told by dealers what the market would bear for something like this, because there was already a lot of other stuff kind of out there that was doing that.
Oh, yeah.
And I had to make a few compromises in the design that I wasn't totally thrilled with. So I think it's a good unit, and I think it's got a great reverb. It's not as exciting to me as the reverb in this unit. And it's because of the fact that we had to run 12AX7 as a driver tube rather than this one, which has an EL34 in it.
Gotcha.
Or excuse me, EL84 as
it's
a driver tube.
Okay. Okay.
And so I started to redesign this a few years before I closed the business. And I would have liked to have gotten it back into production, but I just never had the time. And there wasn't enough demand. I mean,
Sure.
even when this came out, we sold very few.
There's a ton of pedals that do reverb.
Yeah, well, that's the
and,
thing.
yeah,
When
it's-
this came out, it was still ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
When this came out, there was a million pedals out you could buy
Yeah.
that could do the same thing.
Yeah.
So we were competing with we were bringing a dinosaur to a modern era, and
And just, yeah.
and for purists it was great. But God, I have to be totally honest and say that there were pedals you could buy that could do everything this thing could do.
You know what's interesting? There is a kit you can buy that is a spring reverb kit that's tube driven.
Oh, well, that's cool.
It's around $200, almost $300 ish. They'll give you the transformers and the tube sockets and everything, and you can make it. So maybe it'll come back. Maybe people will want reverb. Who knows?
Could be, and there is a product that I don't know if it's available still, but it was available a few years back that Billy Zoom makes that kills this thing. I mean,
Oh, wow.
he is. I mean, I'll be the first to admit it. His just took it to a whole nother level.
Was it a rack unit or was it something?
I think it was in like a little cabinet,
Oh, a cabinet,
a little
okay.
standalone thing. Maybe it was rack mountable. I don't remember. I never actually really got a chance to play around with one.
Okay.
But he knocked it out of the park. When I heard one at the NAMM show one year, it blew me away. I was like, wow, that's a really good one.
Very cool.
So,
Mike, thank you for your time talking about rack gear with me in your retirement.
Oh,
and,
you're welcome. Yeah.
Hopefully everybody out there in YouTube land enjoys the stories and the details over all the units that he made.
Yeah. Well, it's been my pleasure as well, and I hope you guys enjoyed it too.
Take care.